Joining us today via Zoom from the United States, Storycon's resident political pundit, Ronald Llamas. Kamusta dyan, Ronald?
Good morning, Joby, Patrick. Wala man dyan ngayon. Good afternoon pala.
Good afternoon dito. Pero medyo naano ako dun sa binasa ko na no first item ko, strobe lights. Parang 80s ang naaalala ko pag sinabing strobe lights. Parang mga disco
Parang
ng
70s.
80s.
Parang 70s.
That's true. Pero isa pala yung sa mga ginamit.
Ronald, now we know why it took some time for our officials to shed light on what actually happened in Ayungin Shoal on that day, no? I think June 17. Alam kasi medyo ano, no? Well, I mean, it was surprising na water cannon lang, maingay na tayo kaagad. Pero ito, medyo natagalan ng reaction. And when we saw in videos released by the Armed Forces of the Philippines what actually happened, it was quite alarming and disturbing to say the least, no, Ronald?
Tama, Patrick, Joby. Talagang kinuyog sila eh. Talagang ginulpi. Kitang-kita mo. Buti nga ay wala masyadong casualties dahil nung binangga yung kanilang speedboat, full throttle yung Chinese vessel na bumangga sa kanila. Buti na lang ay nakaiwas sila sa major casualties. At saka katulad yan yung nangyari sa border ng India at saka China more than a year ago, kung maalala mo, Patrick, Joby. Walang gumamit ng barel, pero may mga bolo, may mga sibat, at may mga pamalo. No? Dahil nga, pag gumamit na ng barel, baka magsimula ang gera. Kaya ang ginawa nila, parang rumble. Rumble yung nangyari. No? Pero maraming injured. At later on, ay nagkaroon din ng casualties. Parang ganun yung ginawang estilo rito.
So by design yan, Ronald, yung sinasabing nagmistulang mga pirata ng Chinese Coast Guard dahil sa mga ginamit na weapons. It was by design. It still falls under gray zone tactics, I guess, no? Na below armed and kinetic force.
Iba kasi, Patrick, pag gumamit na ng mga baril eh. No? Iba na yung mga kwadila. Tingin nila, itong ginawa nila ngayon ay hindi pa sapat para mag-invoke ng Mutual Defense Treaty. At least from the perspective of the Chinese.
Okay.
No? Kaya sabi mo, tama ka, it's still part of the gray zone activity. Parang short of war, yung ganyang klaseng harassment at saka aggression, ay medyo yan yung gagawin nilang estilo. Ilaway, ginawa na nila yan eh. Yung mga ilaw, yung mga ingay, no? Yung mga iba't ibang klase, para lang maiwasan na sabihin na nagsimula sila ng gera. Ikalawa, mukhang meron ding kailangan ayusin sa ating strategy at saka tactics. Kaya siguro hindi kaagad nagsalita yung ating armed forces at saka gobyerno for more than 2 days. Dahil mukhang kinakailangan dyan na mas malawak at mas malalim na coordination sa lahat ng ating mga forces. AFP, Navy, Westcom, Coast Guard, at saka National Security Council. Nakita mo dyan, one of the few times na ang ginamit dyan ay yung NABSOG, yung Navy Special Operations Group. Yan yung ating parang Navy SEALs. No? At yan na yung elite of the elite ng ating Navy. Pero ayun na, medyo nagulpi sila ng husto at naagaw pa yung kanilang mga armas. Baka next time, wag na sila magdala ng armas kung hindi naman talaga handang gamitin.
Pana na lang din, di ba? Pana sa pana. Parang gano'n. Sibat sa sibat.
Going back to the gray zone tactic na sinasabi natin sa mga conversation since yesterday, Patrick and Ronald, baka nga by design, kasi alam nila na basta wag mag-go over that kind of tactic or na pamamaraan. Kasi tingnan mo, ngayon, tinitingnan ko yung video habang nag-uusap kayong dalawa. Sabi mo, may dalang GoPro, tapos bolo yung hawak sa kabilang kamay. Parang may disconnect pagdating sa technology ng dalawa. So parang gusto ko lang palabasin na, alam nila na kapag nga naman dumating na sa armas or modern na gagamitin, baka mag-go beyond that gray zone.
Ito pinapakita natin video, Jovi, grabe ito, no? That's the Philippine boat. Filipino NAVSOCOM boat caught in the middle.
Yes.
Talagang inipit No, Ronald,
At
I
hindi
wonder
lang
if you see the
inipit,
video.
Patrick. Nung binunggo yan, high speed yun. Yun yung hindi
Oh,
nakita.
that's true.
Binunggo kasi yan high speed. Tapos tinow. Kinuha nyo, tinow nila yan Dalawa na barko natin, tinow nila, hinatak. Pero nasa likod, hindi nakikita, nandyan din yung ating BRP Cabra at saka BRP Bakakay. No? Hindi na sila sumama dun sa confrontation, pero nandyan sila na handa dapat sumaklolo.
Ronald, I just like to go back to the original video that we showed a while ago. Nung, it would seem that that confrontation where itong video na ito, no? It would seem that this video is being taken from aboard the BRP Sierra Madre. So they got all the way there. The Chinese Coast Guard got that close. It would seem, Ronald?
Kaya nga ang ginamit na, nabsog na, dahil nga yung mga usual supply missions natin, talagang halos totally hinarangan na. Tapos yung mga binabagsak natin ng supply from the air, medyo hindi pinpoint yung accuracy niya Kaya naaagaw ng mga Chinese at pagkaagaw, tatapon sa dagat. Yun yung nakita natin more than a week ago. Dahil sinubukan natin kasi na magbigay ng supply sa BRP Sierra Madre sa pamamagitan ng pagbagsak through our air assets. Pero hindi umabot sa BRP Sierra Madre at napunta sa Chinese Coast Guard na ipinakita nila, na itinatapon nila. So medyo desperate yung situation ng ating BRP Sierra Madre. Lalo na kinakailangang ayusin yung kanilang desalination machine, yung paglinis nung tubig alat para pwedeng mainom, pwedeng panligo, etc. So medyo may problema na yon. Kaya maraming dalasan na supply yung ating mga NAVSOG, Navy Special Operations Group, beyond sa pagkain. Dahil kailangan nilang ayusin yung desalination machine.
Okay, the living conditions, kumbaga, on board
makikita
the Sierra
natin
Madre.
na talagang sasakalin yung BRP Sierra Madre para tayo na mismo yung kusang umatras, kusang umalis. Tapos tsaka nila iti-take over. Kaya nasa isang medyo defining moment yung ating BRP Sierra Madre sa Ayungin at this point.
Okay, Ronald, I wonder, no, you mentioned a while ago na there was a similar clash involving China and India at the border many years ago. It did not necessarily escalate to an all-out war or all-out conflict. Is it still possible for both sides, for both China and the Philippines, to walk back or walk away from this incident?
Well, lagi namang nandun yung possibility because of diplomacy. Ang problema lang, Patrick, mukhang baka mahirapan ng umatras yung China doon sa kanilang artificial islands na itinayo nila. Dahil bilyon na ang nagastos dyan Tapos hindi lang yan simpleng islands. Meron ng runway, meron ng pantalan, meron ng submarine pens, no? Meron ng, hindi ako magugulat kung meron ng shopping mall, yung mga islands na yan. Kaya I doubt kung yan ay babaklasin nila at aatras sila. Maliban pa na dyan nila sinusukat yung kanilang territorial waters at saka maritime waters. So, yun yung problema Yes, pwede pa namang lagi nandun naman yung possibility ng pag-de-escalate. Pero dahil dyan sa 9 or 10 dash line ng China na ang front line ay yung kanilang artificial islands, na hindi na lamang territorial at saka maritime waters nila, kung hindi ginawa na nilang parang mga military camps na may mga missiles, submarines, etc., ay baka mahirapan na silang umatras. Sa India kasi, matagal lang border war yan Kung maalala nyo, nagkaroon pa ng 2 gera ang India at saka China dyan sa borders na yan. Yung nangyari na ganyang klaseng confrontation, I think nangyari yan mga 2 years ago lang 2022. Parang gray zone din dahil iniwasan nilang gumamit ng military hardware. Ang ginamit nila, katulad ng ginawa rito, mga bolo, mga pamalo, at mga sibat. Pero dun sa isang encounter last year, may mga namatay na mga Indians kahit hindi gumamit ng barel. Kaya delikado rin yung ganitong incident. Dahil naputulan nga ng right thumb yung isang nating NAVSOG Imagine mo kung sa leeg tumama yan. No? Imagine mo kung yung pagtama ng high speed dun sa dun sa dingy natin ay merong tinamaan talaga. So, ito yung pinaka-dangerous operation so far ng China. At kitang-kita natin dito sa mga video.
But Ronald, you seem convinced that there's only one way to go from here.
Yung committee ng Mutual Defense, yung Mutual Defense Committee, dahil merong mga chismis na baka nag-meeting na para pag-usapan itong incident na ito.
Okay, Ronald, you seem convinced that this is only going to go down one way. There's no stepping back or stepping away from this incident. Parang yun ang sinasabi mo. Ganun ba talaga? I mean, this is a red line that...
Patrick,
is this Rubicon?
Ang pinakamahalaga na element dyan para mag-de-escalate at this point, no, ay international pressure. International pressure. Dahil yun yung vulnerability ng China. Economics. At for now, yung malaking bahagi ng mundo, Europe, India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, etc., even parts of Latin America, ay medyo concerned sa nangyayari. Hindi lang dahil sa usapin ng West Philippine Sea, kundi sa usapin ng freedom of navigation at usapin ng possible global conflict. Kaya sa ngayon, yung pressure ay nasa almost the entire world. Halimbawa, narinig natin yung G7 na naglabas ng statement tungkol dito sa incident na ito at iba pang mga bansa na una pa sa atin. Tingin ko yun, for now, yun yung pinaka-compelling pressure sa China na mag-de-escalate.
Okay.
Dahil ang kinakailangan mag-de-escalate, China eh. Dahil tayo naman, yung ating ine-escalate, supply lang eh.
Yeah.
Nagdadala lang tayo ng supply eh. No?
Ronald,
So ano yung ating i-de-escalate? Wala tayong i-de-escalate eh.
Yeah.
China ang kinakailangan mag-de-escalate at for China to de-escalate, kailangan ng global pressure.
Okay.
At sa ngayon, nag-i-scale up yung global pressure na yan.
Okay.
Ronald,
Ronald.
ano tayo dyan? I-hold natin ng konti yung ating discussion tungkol dito sa West Philippines because we'll be talking to at least two guests regarding this issue maya-maya. Ano? Pero baka kasi makalimutan natin ito. Just let's give them updates din doon sa political developments naman dito sa ating bansa. Ano? So first, after that resignation from the DepEd portfolio ni Vice President Sara Duterte, nagbigay na ng payag ang Malacanang ulit, Patrick and Ronald, na hindi pa sila nag-a-assign ng kapalit because there's a transition period na gagalangan nila. They'll respect that until July 19.
30 days.
30 days. So hindi pa mag-name si President Bongbong Marcos ng replacement or ng next DepEd secretary. Pero meron pang ibang mga nagaganap na pangyayari.
Well, sana magandang closing to pero since pasok mo na.
Pinapasok. Kaya sabi ko, okay, maganda sana so pero...
Marami naglabas na ng statement.
Oh yeah, the statements made by...
Senate President Escudero, Amy Marcos, no, ex-human rights lawyer Harry Roque. So, ang daming statements yung lumalabas. No?
Okay. And from Congresswoman Gloria Arroyo, she said that
she's not now in any position to
make a comment.
To make a comment about the resignation.
What do you make out of that comment? That non-comment.
Classic Gloria Macapagal Arroyo.
How do you read into that, Ronald?
Well, ang si GMA kasi keeps her cards close to her heart eh. Hindi niya nilalabas yung kanyang mga plano, no? At baka sa lahat ng mga players dito, siya yung pinaka in a way sophisticated. No? Medyo nakatago yung kanyang mga tunay na layunin at yung kanyang mga tunay na mga tactics.
Okay.
Tingin ko hindi naman tayo maliligaw na yung kanyang sympathies, yung kanyang support ay nakesara. Pero hindi niya yun ipapakita. Until makita niya na tawag dito, committed na siya na ilantad yung kanyang mga baraha. Sabi
I
ni
wonder,
Harry
Ronald,
Roque kasi, the lines have been drawn formally.
Yes.
Ibig sabihin, tinatanggap niya that the lines were drawn informally much earlier. No? Halimbawa, after nung election, na inamin naman ni Vice President Sara Duterte last June 12, na after the election ay as far as she is concerned, wala na yung unity. At kung maalala mo, medyo after the election, may mga nagsimula ng samaan ng loob. Dahil mukhang ang gustong makuha ni Vice President Sara ay hindi yung DepEd. Mukhang ang balak niya makuha ay yung Secretary of National Defense na hindi niya nakuha. Ikalawa, si Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, yung kanyang mentor, ang gusto ay maging speaker at hindi rin niya nakuha.
Yeah.
Kaya baka totoo naman yung sinabi ni Sara last June 12, Independence Day, na after the election ay talaga namang wala na yung unity. At bahagi niyan ay dahil hindi nila nakuha yung mga gusto nila, DND at saka speakership. At the rest is history. Tambaluslos, pagtanggal kay GMA as Senior Deputy Speaker, pagtanggal ng mga hundreds of millions ng confidential at saka intelligence funds, etc. etc. Statement ni First Lady against Vice President Sara. So marami nang nangyari ng mga kabanata. Pero nagsimula yan immediately after the election. Tingin ko tama si Vice President Sara Duterte ron na inamin lang niya last June 12.
Okay. Before namin i-flash ulit yung reaction from an ally of the Vice President, yung favorite character ngayon ni Ronald na si Attorney Harry Roque. Fina-flash siya kanina. Dahil meron siyang interesting na sinabi doon. Meron lang nagko-comment na yung yung statement naman daw, in contrast doon sa statement ni Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, ni Congresswoman Gloria, na medyo safe, yung kay Senator Amy Marcos daw is parang may pero may emotions doon sa mga lines na yung kanyang pagpo-profess ng pagiging niya. Ayan. Yung ang aking pagmamahal, mga ganyang linyahan. Pagmamahal, pagtitiwala at paniniwala sa kabutihan daw ni Vice President Duterte ay hindi daw kailanman magmamaliw. So,
Translate. Medyo lumang Tagalog.
Lumang Tagalog na
ano ba yung
emotional.
pagmamaliw?
Hindi mababawasan. Ayun. Tama
okay.
ako.
Hindi mababawasan. Tama si
Hindi
Joby,
mababawasan.
Patrick.
Walang humpay, walang hanggan,
ang tanong dyan,
walang
Patrick,
kamatayan.
Joby, ay ngayon kasi nagde-negotiate yung partido ni Amy, yung nationalista, with the government to be part of the administration slate. Sa ganitong statement, parang medyo hindi papunta ron. No? Ang ibig bang sabihin ng kanyang statement ay sasama siya dun sa bubuin ni Sara Duterte na opposition slate sa Senate sa midterm? Or tuloy pa rin yung kanilang negotiations as nationalista to be part of the administration slate? Yun yung medyo tatamaan dito sa statement ni Amy Marcos. Dahil sa statement niya, parang hindi niya iiwanan si Vice President Sara. At malinaw, ang direksyon ni Vice President Sara is to lead the opposition. To lead the opposition slate, lalo na sa Senate, this coming midterms.
Ronald, aren't we giving parang ino-overrate natin yung importance ng party lines in Philippine elections? Because we've seen with every elections, lalo lumalabo yung party lines. I mean, how many elections na nag-a-adapt ng mga iba't ibang kandidato yung mga partido. They share candidates, they share lineup and all that.
Kumbaga, kung kandidato ka, pwede ka sumampa sa entablado ng iba pagkakampanya.
My point, Ronald, is that, she has publicly stated that she stands by Sara Duterte. I think that's more born out of a guilty feeling because she was responsible for bringing them together. Yeah. But at the same time, Ronald, she is family, right? She is still a Marcos. Yes. She is still the brother of the president and all that.
Kaya nga ang tingin ko, Patrick, iba kasi yung pag-adapt, iba yung formally sasama yung partido nila sa ruling coalition at sa Senado.
Hindi,
But that's all,
kasi
pwedeng hindi ka sumama
Ronald,
pwedeng hindi ka sumama like last election.
Right.
Ronald, may mga senatorial na inadapt ng ibang presidente, pero sumama sila sa entablado sa isang presidente lang.
Okay. We've seen that, Ronald. Pero bottom line, isn't that all just optics? You know, para hindi
Baka
sumamalob ng
hindi,
isa, di ba? Para hindi lang sumamalob ng isa.
Dahil halimbawa, kung sasama ka sa admin, tapos sasama ka sa opposition, ilalaglag ka ng admin. No, ilalaglag ka ng mga sasamaan loob. No?
Does that follow,
yun yung
Ronald?
pwedeng maging implication nun, Patrick.
Ronald, does that follow? Dahil sabi ko nga, after all, bottom line, kapatid pa rin to.
Yes.
Yun.
Pero bilang kapatid, saan ba siya sasama na kampanya? Paano? Magsasabay ng kampanya yan no? Lalo na, iba ito last election. Ito talaga medyo antagonistic nakakatawa nga na mas antagonistic pa ngayon yung magkaaway na unity kesa dun sa last election. Kesa yung red versus the pink. Na-notice mo, mas antagonistic At least yung labanan last election between the pink and the red, hindi umabot sa mga usapin ng destabilization, mutiny, coup, secession, assassination. Ito umabot hanggang dun So medyo mas intense, mas antagonistic itong kampanya na parating sa midterm. Lalo na kung papasok pa yung ICC before the midterm. Kaya medyo naiiba ito in level, intensity ng antagonism at saka contradictions kesa nung last election ng 2022. Kaya medyo mahirap na mamangka sa dalawang ilog dito sa election na ito. Baka lalo kang mas tamaan.
Okay.
Okay. Sige.
Mukhang klaro yun. Sabi nga ni Ron, I think that was a definitive response. Ibang class, ibang level yung antagonism nito, no? This election. Well, we have to point out lang, Ronald, the last elections, the partisans on the ground, they were very polarized and divided. But as you pointed out, ibang level to ngayon. Itong contest nito on many counts nga dahil for the reasons that you mentioned, may mga pagbabanta here and there and there.
Pero inonote din natin na ito ay dahil midterm, walang tumatakbong presidente o vice-presidente, talaga nakatuon ng pansin natin doon sa mga senatorial balls na pwede nga mag-away-away kasi kumbaga hindi na, sila na yung nasa spotlight niya unlike kapag yung usual
para kasi, Ronald, parang nag-iba na yung dynamics sa senatorial elections natin. Once upon a time, maybe many election cycles ago, natatandaan ko pa, you wanna get into the administration ticket for primarily the reason that nandun yung pondo, right? Pero I think a lot of senatorial elections are finding that being independent is not a bad thing too. Na especially because the parties don't necessarily bankroll all of their candidates in the ticket.
Yeah.
Well, kung meron kang brand na very compelling, katulad halimbawa ng mga tulpo, na sa ngayon, sila yung pinaka-compelling na brand.
You can be independent.
Hindi nila kailangan ng partido or slate, no? Although makakatulong yun, makakasigurado sa kanila at magpapataas ng kanilang ratings. Hindi sila mapupunta sa bandang dulo. Mananalo sila, pero nandun sila sa bandang dulo kung hindi sila bahagi ng administration slate. Pero ngayon, kung kasama sila sa administration slate, tapos meron pa silang compelling na brand, kasama sila sa magtatap. No, na siguro malamang nasa top 4 or top 5 yan. Kung kasama sila sa administrations, yun yung dagdag, no? Yun yung dagdag. Pero yung karamihan ng tumatakbo ngayon, tatakbo sila sa isang context na very antagonistic yung labanan. Existential nga Existential yung labanan Dahil may mga elements at play na wala doon sa mga previous elections natin. Ngayon lang first time na merong ICC na elephant in the room. Ngayon lang for the first time, may bungguan yung dalawang superpower na magpa-factor in sa election. Ngayon lang na nagkaroon, ako sa tagal ko sa politika, na yung mga threat sa incumbent ay ganyang katindi. Secession, mutiny, sedition, people power, at saka even assassination. No, so, yun lang yung sinasabi ko na kaibahan sa mga previous elections. Very existential, very antagonistic itong eleksyon na ito. Kaya yung mga senador ay medyo magdadalawa, magtatatlong isip na magpa-adapt sa iba na labas ng kanilang main slate.
Okay, maraming salamat. Ronald Llamas, our resident political pundit, live from the US, no, on Zoom. Thank you, Ronald.
Salamat.
Thank you, Ronald.
Nagbabiyahe-biyahe rin tayo ngayon. Pupunta rin sa Europe sa first week of July. Pero wala akong kasamang Mr. Supranational.
Binalik pa talaga.
And on that, the best way to end your interview. Thank you, Ronald Llamas.
Thank you, Ronald. And here in the studio, our, well, you know him, the maritime security expert, Mr. Ray Powell. Hi, Ray.
Okay. Mr. Powell is the director of the Sea Light Gordian Knot Center for National Security Aviation. It sounds so esoteric. Basically, it's based in Stanford, and what you do is try to shed light or put the spotlight on China's gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea. Now,
And aside from Mr. Ray Powell, we also have on the phone security analyst Chester Cabalza. Chester will be listening in and chiming in on our conversation.
okay, Mr. Powell, first question. I don't know how to gently land this question, but we were surprised that the Navy SEALs, Filipino Naval SEALs, were used in those supply missions to the BRP Sierra Madre. What's happening? Is there a feud, or is there a? I understand that the National Security Council was not aware of this move.
Well, I can't speak to what the National Security Council knew or didn't know. It's not surprising, or wouldn't be surprising, if there are differences of opinion in any cabinet, right? I mean, that's what you'd expect in a cabinet. I can understand to some degree, the desire to mix it up, to do something different, because I think, over time there was a sense that the Philippines was doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same result.
Not working, in short.
Right.
We're talking about measured transparency.
Well, it's not just the transparency. It's the actual, the way that the ships would go and approach the shoal, where that they would meet the supply boats. All of these things, there was a certain sameness to them, and I think that there was probably some desire to be able to do something different, to see if they couldn't sort of, try a little extra stealth, a little extra speed, something different to change it up. Now, I mean, obviously the result was not what anybody wanted, but it was different.
Mr. Cabalza, are you on the line?
Yes. Actually,
Yes,
about
Chester.
that question. Yeah, about that question. Originally, when we talk about a resupply mission, it's actually a military mission.
Okay.
That's the reason why we have seen the Navy there. It just so happened that first we are giving more emphasis now to the Philippine Coast Guard, because of course when we talk about the West Philippine Sea, we would want to see the role of police power. That's the reason why we are empowering the Philippine Coast Guard, because issues surrounding the West Philippine Sea should be a civilian issue and not a military issue.
So are we seeing a question for both of you? We're seeing a difference in approaches and a difference in policy, at least in insights, from the NEC side and from the DND side. Is that what we're seeing right now?
Well, I mean, I think certainly, specifically with respect to transparency, there was a difference here, right? There were not embedded reporters. There were not immediate, we didn't see the footage immediately. It took a little while for all that to come out. So the transparency thing was different. And again, I can't speak as to why that was, but perhaps it had to do with operational security. Perhaps it may have something to do with the concern about
Navy SEALs don't travel with cameras.
Not
or
usually.
media.
Not usually. Now there were cameras around, but no, they don't. I mean,
Not reporters.
Exactly.
Okay.
So embedded reporters and Navy SEALs are not the usual pairing. But I mean, I think that the real question is, has this sort of shown us what the limits are? Go ahead.
Yeah.
What the limits are to what the Philippines is able to do with this type of resupply mission, and whether it needs to begin to explore some broader options.
Okay. Did it work?
Well, I mean,
Plan B?
I mean, clearly it didn't. It did not appear to produce a successful resupply, at least from what we've seen, right? And clearly we can't keep having that kind of a result. I mean, I'm speaking as simply an observer, right? So I think that we are certainly at an inflection point.
An inflection point.
Yep.
Is it a dangerous inflection point?
Sure.
Is it an inflection point? Okay, why?
Well, I mean, so here's what I believe, and I've said this a few times today. So I think that we are at the point where the Marcos administration needs to give serious consideration toward approaching, the U.S. allies and saying we need to be having formal Article 3 mutual defense treaty consultations on how we go forward from here, right? At this point, what is needed is some clarity across the board, some clarity from the Philippine side as to what they expect and want out of their U.S. allies, some clarity from the U.S. side as to what that they expect and to be able to provide and can provide, and frankly, clarity on the Chinese side so that they understand what the implications are of carrying out an illegal blockade against a U.S. ally in its own exclusive economic zone.
Mr. Cabalza. Yes.
Yeah.
Your take.
Yes, I agree that there are gray areas when we talk about the Mutual Defense Treaty. One, of course, is remember that this was crafted in 1951, and we are referring now to 2024, where we have gray zone tactics. And the reasons why we have seen creativity from the part of the China Coast Guard in using gray zone tactics is to widen the expanse also of their operations. Remember, last time they used the the light war, and then of course the water cannon. This time around, they're using a different thing. So you see different kinds of tactics, perhaps to confuse us, and of course, this is also to give some leeway on how they would expand the kind of operation when we talk about the gray zone tactics. And I think this is the gray zone of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which we haven't seen since 1951. So it has to be discussed between and among the United States, the Philippines, and some other strategic partners in order for us to have a unified action when we do some resupply mission, or what are the expectations from our friends when China tries to challenge us.
Okay, Joey.
Mr. Powell just said that there should be a conversation between our president and the United States regarding that article, right? Article 3?
Article 3.
Article 3. But the Senate leadership, Senate President Escudero just said this morning that he's got a different suggestion. His suggestion is for our country to have another dialogue with the Chinese.
Okay.
So is that one of the options that we should be considering?
Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive options,
okay.
right? I mean, there shouldn't be any sort of restriction on dialogue with your adversary, right? I mean, obviously, if you think that the dialogue can lead to a productive place, I think one of the things that we've seen, though, is that China's expectation is that what the Philippines will come to is an acquiescence, is a conciliation to China's jurisdiction over Ayungin Shoal, right? So what was it about the new model that emerged back in February that was so controversial? Well, it was the fact that China wanted the Philippines to give them pre-notification, frankly, for pre-approval, under certain conditions, and what the problem with that was that it would yield to China the jurisdiction, right? It would yield the sort of the high ground to say, well, and now like China could say, okay, the Philippines has agreed that we are in charge here, and they have to submit their plans for approval, right? So the question is, do we think that another dialogue would result in something better, with something a more acceptable compromise?
Okay, Mr. Cabalza, is the MDT the only course we can take at this point, or can we walk back both sides and take the diplomatic route?
Well, we have alternative mechanisms on how to resolve these high tensions. Remember that it's very complex. This does not only entail about the Mutual Defense Treaty, but of course it needs skillful negotiation. Because of course, like what we have heard from Mr. Powell, that of course, what if there is assistance coming from China, that the reasons why perhaps we would want to have a bilateral talk with the Philippines, because they have already an agreed decision on the concession of the Ayungin Shoal. But perhaps more than that, I think we need naval diplomacy to ease out. Certainly, the points the point of the Philippine Navy and its counterpart from the from the People's Liberation Army Navy should also talk. Of course, the last time our president talked with Xi Jinping was by the time when he was in California for the APEC summit for sometime last year. So I said, if we try to negotiate this time around, given that first we have to hear their side and at the same time offer what are the expectations of the Philippines, I don't think that would hinder us from further talks with China. So I think since it's a complex issue, it needs more maturity when it comes to negotiating with China, especially that we are seeing high tensions in the high seas right now.
Okay, want to add something, Mr. Powell?
Well, unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear much of what he said. But what I would maybe just sort of add on is when we talk about these options not being mutually exclusive, when you go into a negotiation against an adversarial, party, you want to go in from a position of strength, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be sort of overwhelmed. And so when you walk in, if the other party has an effective blockade of your military outpost that you have been unable to really break, and you don't really have other options, as to how you're going to do it, that leaves you in a position of weakness. You don't want to have to negotiate from that position. So working with, a stronger ally, your American ally, somebody who is obligated to you under treaty, increases your leverage going into a negotiation. Because in the end, what we do want to see happen here is a successful negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
It may involve compromise of some sort, but a compromise that's acceptable to the Philippine people. And the way to get that ultimately is to have enough in your corner so that your negotiating adversary is forced to make those concessions to you even as you're making concessions to them.
Okay, before the armed forces of the Philippines released videos of that incident in Ayungin, Shoal, there was scant or very scarce information on the details surrounding that incident. Yeah. Okay, coming from both sides, even China and the Philippines, there was condemnation, but the statements from both sides did not provide any details. Is it correct to sense that there was some attempt, at least, to soften
or to
manage this incident from both the Philippine and the Chinese side?
That's hard to say, right? Now, so what you saw was...
Because normally, excuse me,
Go ahead.
Mr. Powell, normally a simple water cannon incident and it's all over the news. Yeah. Okay, and we provide them all the details.
Right.
It took some time for the Philippine side, at least, to release these images, which are quite.
What you saw was China, as it has now grown used to doing, immediately put out information. I mean, in the minutes after the first incident, started to put out information about how it took control measures and against the illegal trespass. And
it sounded very generic.
But to me, it sounded very normal.
Okay,
right?
normal.
So this is what the China Coast Guard has now the habit of doing. It wants to be first out with the first information, giving their side of the story. And so that was really our first indication that something had happened. And what we then saw was, as you say, a longer delay than we're used to. In fact, in many cases,
the original statement from Defense Secretary Gibo Chidoro was also very, general. There was a condemnation, but it did not provide any details of the incident.
I mean, I think it's fair to assume that there was a discussion in the government as to how they wanted to sort of frame all of what had just happened, because what had just happened, as everyone can see, it was really sort of a level above the other thing. I mean, there was a personal nature to the conflict that was happening out there. It goes beyond the picture of a water cannon hitting a ship. Right. Here you have a man standing with a hatchet threatening another man in a raft next to him.
And this is very damaging to the reputation of the armed forces. Because these are uniformed personnel, the best of the Philippine armed forces.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, so first of all, they fought back, right? They fought back, but they also exercised restraint, understanding that, first of all, they were surrounded, right? They were well outnumbered, and they were actually not sent out there to enter into armed conflict, right? They were sent out there to deliver supplies. And so they exercised restraint. Now, things didn't go well. And, those things should be thoroughly reviewed. We have these things called after-action reviews where everybody deep dives and say, why didn't it go well, right? And, there will probably be things that come up where you should do things better. I remember all the way back I'm old enough to remember, back in 1979, when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and we had hostages being held in Iran, and there was a rescue attempt which went badly, right? And they tried to do some things that they had never done before. In some senses, the Philippines is trying to do some things it's never done before because it is facing an unprecedented challenge in terms of having to try to resupply this ship. And so when those things don't go well, then you go back and you say, why didn't it go well? And you have that after-action review, and you come back and figure out how you can be more successful next time. So, there's an old saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Okay,
I wanted
Mr.
to ask
Cabalza?
Mr. Cabalza if it's also interesting for you that it took some time for our officials to even acknowledge what happened in Ayungin.
Yes, of course. I think there's a different level of warfare right now. I think their cognitive warfare played also a major role in terms of how they would try to visualize what happened there. China gave their first narration about the incident. Perhaps this is an attempt to tell to them that we have peace on the non-trespassing law that they're trying to enforce to foreign fishers. And I think that is the kind of narrative that we would want to show to the world. But for me, I think the armed forces of the Philippines is trying to recalculate also their strategy because, of course, I agree with Mr. Powell there that their mission there is for resupply mission and not for armed conflict. That's why what we have seen in the recent incident is how would I say it? Not well calculated based from the perspective of the armed forces of the Philippines.
Okay, are we seeing a difference in strategy within, I go back to the question, between the armed forces and the National Security Council? Is the AFP impatient, losing patience, for example?
I think everybody's losing patience, right? And frankly, because the situation seems intractable. I do think we are reaching kind of a critical point. So, several months ago, I was writing about what I have been calling for many months now, the blockade of BRP Sierra Madre, and how China's approach seemed to be to try to limit the amount of materials that could be brought to the Sierra Madre so that it could not be repaired or replaced and eventually succumb to the elements. Now what we what we may be seeing is an attempt to actually essentially starve out the occupants and force the Philippines to essentially either basically pull them off and abandon the outpost. If that is indeed what China is trying to get to here, or get the Philippines to sort of succumb or submit to their jurisdiction, if that's what we're coming to, then the Philippines is going to have to make some really hard decisions, right? Because at some point they will run out of food, they will run out of water, they will not be able to move people on and off the ship if China continues down this road, which is why I think that this is the time for these consultations. So, is there such a thing as Article 3 consultations? I don't know. I mean, when I read Article 3, it talks about consultations based on these things, but it is what you decide it is. And if you decide that this is time to call them formally Article 3 consultations, that's what they'll be.
One last question. Before we even get to Article 3, I understand there's something else on the table. U.S. Coast Guard or Navy boats escorting Philippine resupply missions.
Presence.
That's been put on the table a couple of times. You see that happening? Is that a more sensible course of action than MDT?
I think
Article
under
3.
the NDT, that would be an option. right? So I think when we like to say, when we're talking about deterrence and we're talking about military options, we like to say all options are on the table. It should be an option that's on the table.
Okay, with that, thank you for joining the Storycon today. Maritime security expert Ray Powell and also security analyst Chester Cabalsa.
Thanks,
and
Chester.
a while ago, Ronald Llamas, our resident political pundit.
And join us again tomorrow at 4 p.m. for the Storycon. I'm Jovi Francisco.
I'm Patrick Paez. We are One News, all sides, all the time. This is the Story Conference Group or the Storycon Group.